So I'm going to be talking about the overwhelming importance of vaccinations for public health. And I want to say I appreciate Dr. Anderson inviting me to speak, and I appreciate the MAPS program's focus on applying science to current issues in our culture. I was here for the last presentation on climate science, which was very interesting. And since I'm a physician, I need to preface my talk tonight with a comment that isn't intended to supply general information. For specific decisions about your personal health, you should always talk with your own doctor. So I think that vaccinations are one of the most important public health advances in human history. So I would put it down with the same importance as clean water, nutritious food, sanitary waste disposal, and healthy housing accommodations. Now that's a gigantic claim, so we want to go through and talk a little bit about that. To understand the infectious diseases that I'll talk about, you really need to see pictures of the victims. Some of these pictures tonight that I'm going to show are very difficult to look at, especially if you're a young mom or if you're a grandparent like me. They may be disturbing, but as physicians, we use pictures to learn about and recognize diseases. The story that they tell may help to prevent people from suffering in the future from these miserable and potentially fatal diseases. I'm well aware that many people in the US and Europe are worried about the risks of vaccinations and that those outweigh the benefits. So Dr. Anderson asked me to give this talk as a result of this year's widespread measles outbreak in the US, which affected many unvaccinated people. Many of the news articles about this measles outbreak attributed it to what is called vaccine hesitancy among parents. So as a family physician for 35 years in Modesto, I've had many conversations, hundreds of conversations, thousands, over the years with concerned parents about their children and with adult patients about themselves. And I always respected the sincerity of people and their desire to analyze risks and benefits of vaccinations. But tonight I'm going to concentrate on the benefits because I think those are the most misunderstood when it comes to the topic of vaccinations. The diseases that I'm going to talk about are called vaccine-preventable infectious diseases. This slide shows the ones I'm going to talk about tonight. They're not every one, but they're the ones I have time to really address tonight. I'm going to use the very colloquial word germ at times as a general word for both viruses and bacteria. And of course, I don't mean computer viruses. I had to specify that, seeing how many younger people are here in the room. My sense is that vaccine hesitancy and just outright refusal has slowly increased over the last 40 years. For this reason, I'm going to weave a number of answers to concern about vaccines into tonight's talk. The first question about vaccines is often, do we really need them? I've never heard of anyone I know getting those diseases, is usually the comment I hear after that question. And I think that the best answer for this concern is simply that vaccines have worked too well. So, most people in our present generation of parents have not personally seen someone with measles. No one they know has died of measles, or been hospitalized, or even just suffered the misery of that disease. No family they know has had a parent stay home from work for a week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, while that child is getting over the period of infectivity to others. So I thought I would introduce you to some people from my family who likely would have known the serious consequences of infectious diseases because they experienced them or experienced people around them having them. I'm going to talk about the threats of these diseases. And why am I going to talk about the past? Because I think that the lessons from the past help to inform the present and the future in making informed decisions. So we're going to go all the way back to 1842 to the Rock Creek Baptist Church, established in 1822. This area is around the hamlet of Concord, Alabama, and it was settled by immigrants a little bit before California was. Out back is in the old cemetery of the church is the gravesite of my great-grandfather, Charter Knight. He moved into this area about 1842, and my mom graduated from a nearby high school about 100 years later. So behind his tombstone are burial sites for his 3 wives. And no, he wasn't a polygamist. His wives died sequentially in a row to early deaths prior to his passing. And this was not unusual back in the frontier. So let's think why those frontier women may have died. Well, infectious diseases has to be high on the list. And their frequent pregnancies followed by nursing babies would have made women more susceptible to those diseases. Now, which infectious disease would my great-great-grandparents have feared the most? It isn't a disease that we usually think about. Let me show you the ravages of this disease. It is widely thought to have killed more people than any other infectious disease in the history of the world. In the 20th century alone, just the last century, it killed between 200 to 500 million people. The first site of this disease would have been a high fever up to 104, headaches, nausea, and body aches. This lasted for a few days. Then a rash would have started and evolved over 4 weeks, during which the victim would have been quite contagious. And we're showing the first stage of this rash on this Bosnian little girl. The rash spread within 24 hours all over the skin. And then the skin sores would have become pustular, having filled with a thick opaque fluid and often having a dent in the center, as this photo shows. Many of the victims of this disease still had a high fever and inability to swallow. There were many deaths at this stage. As you see in this photo, the skin lesions can cover a huge amount of the person's skin, lips, and mouth. Some of you may be thinking about the Ebola virus infection right now. Well, in a way, this was the Ebola of the past. These are the characteristic skin spots of smallpox. And this inspired fear and even terror when an outbreak came to your neighborhood. The rash continued to evolve over time, going from sores to pustules to scabs to crusts. 20 to 40% of the victims died. The approximately 70% who lived could have had disfiguring skin scarring and blindness from eye cornea scarring. As you know, smallpox was eliminated from natural circulation in the world in 1977. The vaccination campaign led by the World Health Organization involved simultaneously immunizing 400 million people in the areas where smallpox was still active. It capped 3 decades worth of work in that year, and it was a huge victory for the people of the world. The person that we can thank for this victory is British doctor Edward Jenner, who created a vaccine against smallpox in 1796. Now, he had heard that farm women who milked cows often seemed immune to smallpox. He knew that these women usually got a localized skin disease from cows called cowpox. And he wondered if this was the factor that conferred protection on the women. So he found a farm woman with a fresh cowpox lesion. He then developed a way to preserve the active cowpox virus and scratched it into the skin of several test subjects, including his own son. Now, I believe that Dr. Jenner was a loving father, but he also was a caring physician who knew the ravages that smallpox could bring to his community. There were risks in this first ever trial of a vaccine, but the benefits would prove to be enormous. His vaccine succeeded in giving protection against smallpox, which was in fact closely related to the cowpox virus. He proved this by waiting a few weeks after his test inoculations, then scratching infectious material from smallpox patients into his test subjects. While some of them became mildly ill, none of them developed significant smallpox. This was the first vaccine. In fact, the word vaccine is derived from the Latin word vacca, meaning cow. So why are vaccines necessary at all? It's important to understand the concepts of primary and secondary immune response to germs. The first time that your body encounters a germ like smallpox, it produces the primary or first immune response. This response can take 14 days or more to fully develop. That's a long time to wait. By then, you or your loved one could have suffered a lot or even be dead. Vaccines are designed to stimulate this primary immune response without exposing you to the full-strength natural germ. When your body sees that germ, then it is already prepared. the secondary immune response is stimulated. That is a much faster and more effective response. So vaccination involves stimulating the body's immune system with something different than the full-strength natural germ. This could be a live virus related to the target virus, like the cowpox virus, such as the smallpox vaccine used. The cowpox virus did produce an infection in the recipient, but it was a much milder infection than smallpox. The measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines are similar. They use live attenuated viruses. Now, attenuated means that the natural virus is modified to be much weaker than the full-strength natural virus. Attenuated viruses cause very mild infections in the recipient, stimulating the production of protective antibodies. Even though the viruses are greatly attenuated, people whose immune systems work poorly are at small risk of having a more severe reaction to attenuated live virus vaccines. Therefore, the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, is not recommended for people on drugs that significantly compromise the immune system and for people with diseases that do so. People with blood cell cancer, called leukemia, would be examples of people who should not receive live virus vaccines. So it's also possible to stimulate the immune system to make protective antibodies using purified components of a virus or bacteria. The Tdap vaccine is an example of that. It prevents tetanus, diphtheria, and pneumococcal bacterial infections without using live germs. The word immunization focuses on the body's immune response, which is stimulated by the vaccine, thus protecting the person from future infection. The words vaccination and immunization are often used synonymously. So coming back to my great-grandmother, the spread of smallpox vaccination in America was hampered by vaccine hesitancy. You see, it took decades for Dr. Jenner's smallpox vaccine to gain widespread use. In fact, during the first year that Dr. Jenner proposed using the vaccine, he could only find one other doctor in all of London who would use it for his patients. He faced criticism and even ridicule for continuing to promote the new idea of vaccination, yet he persevered. In doing so, he possibly saved more lives than anyone else in history. It took 200 years for his vaccine to be fully utilized across the world. Yet by creating a vaccine that worked very well, his name is gradually fading into the dustbin of obscurity, along with the terrible disease that it prevented. The concern in Dr. Jenner's time is an example of resistance to ideas or practices that are new to a person, or possibly just incompletely understood. With many in the U.S. having a relatively poor education in health sciences, along with no familial or communal memory of the diseases for which vaccines are used, the case for vaccinations has become poorly understood by many people in the U.S. Now, moving up a generation, I'd like you to meet Bessie Swindle Skelton, my maternal great-grandmother, whom we call Grandma Skelton. She's in the far right of this 1956 family picture, and she was born in 1876. I'm the bigger of the two kids there. I knew her since she lived to 103 years old. So she was a great seamstress, and we have this football quilt that she made in University of Alabama colors for her grandson. She made dresses for all of her granddaughters, including my mother. She never wrote down the measurements for the clothes she made. Those of you who are seamstresses can appreciate this. She took a string and she tied knots to represent the lengths of cloth she needed for sewing. This was because she was illiterate, having never went to school. And we believe that was because her mother was Native American. In addition to smallpox, which was still active in the U.S. during her lifetime due to incomplete use of the vaccine, there were several other infectious diseases she would have known well and feared for herself and her kids. The worst of those was the disease infecting the little guy in this picture. Many of you who are older, who are my age, will remember this disease. I certainly remember it from when I was a kid. I was only 6 or 7 years old, and I remember it being really hot. I felt like I was cooking. And I remember just looking at my brother, who was a blonde-haired guy that looked very much like the kid in this picture, and he was also covered in red spots. This, of course, was measles. The newly infected person usually gets a fever, runny nose, and cough. The fever can be very high, peaking it up to 105 degrees. Just like smallpox, the measles virus is extremely contagious. It is spread by coughing, kissing, and touching things that have been coughed on. It can even stay in the air of a room for up to an hour after the coughing person leaves the room. Now you can understand why public health workers are so concerned when someone with early measles shows up at Disneyland or walks through the airport lobby. After 2 to 4 days of fever, the red blotchy rash starts. It starts on the head, it spreads down the trunk to the extremities, and like smallpox, the skin can be so damaged from the rash that it has to peel off, and it can take weeks to heal. In the decade before 1963, which was the year that the vaccine became available for measles, nearly all children got measles by the time they were 15 years of age. It is estimated 3 to 4 million people in the US were infected every year. 30% of them had some type of complication, the milder of which were diarrhea and heart infections. The more severe complications annually involved about 500 people who died and about 50,000 people who were hospitalized, 1,000 of whom had suffered encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain from measles. Now, these complication rates are bad enough, but the measles vaccine was a tremendous benefit for Americans of my children's generation. But these complication rates for measles actually represent a best case scenario. During my childhood in the 1950s and 60s, the school-age children who were getting measles could tolerate it better than anybody else. The adults had already had it when they were in school, so they didn't get it. So while we got sick for a while with measles, and some people got complications, a few people died, most people got through it without long-term effects. But let's think about Grandma Skeleton and her Native American ancestors. At the time of contact with the Europeans in the 1500s to 1700s, there were large populations of Native Americans throughout North and South America. They had well-organized societies and economies. However, measles had never been present before. So when the extremely infectious diseases of smallpox and measles were brought to America by Europeans and struck the Native American populations, the death rates were actually much higher than what I just quoted for 20th century Americans. You see, everyone got sick, not just the 5 to 20-year-olds whose immune systems were best equipped to fight these diseases. The very young and the old died in much higher numbers. In California, it's estimated that there were about 500,000 Native Americans at the time of European contact. Half of those people were gone within a generation or two. In light of this catastrophe in America, it's extremely ironic that the measles vaccine has been a particular target of people opposed to measles, opposed to vaccines. If only they could talk with my great-grandmother Skeleton about the real fear that measles brought to her community and the people she must have known who lost their lives to this horrible disease. I imagine that she would have been very happy to know that we have protection available now against measles infection. The measles vaccine was developed by a man who was born in the year 1919 in Miles City, Montana. Now, I've never heard of this town. So I looked up the population. It has a booming 8,000 people in Miles City. And people think that Modesto is an obscure small town, right? We'd be half the people in Miles City in this room. They've never been to Miles City. So his name is Maurice Hilleman, and he's credited with saving more lives than any other medical scientist of the 20th century. Robert Gallo, the co-discoverer of the HIV virus, described him as the most successful vaccinologist in history, yet he was as obscure to me as Miles City, Montana. He went to Montana State University for undergrad and University of Chicago for his PhD in microbiology, graduating in 1944, using equipment and techniques that modern microbiologists would find incredibly primitive. He went on to develop many important vaccines, including the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, the Hong Kong flu vaccine, and the hepatitis B vaccine. He even got his family involved. In 1963, when his daughter Geraldine came down with mumps, he cultivated material from her to isolate the virus. This strain was attenuated and it's still used in the MMR vaccine. This graph shows the decline in measles cases after the measles vaccine went into general use in the mid-1960s. Most measles cases weren't reported to the public health departments, but still, this is impressive. The numbers plummeted from about 600,000 annual reported cases to less than 50,000 within a few short years. This greater than 90% drop meant that in the last 50 years, about 23,000 lives have been saved by the vaccine. And there have been 2.4 million hospitalizations prevented, 180 million cases of measles averted in the US. Yet the benefits of this vaccine are now taken for granted because the MMR vaccine works so well. Mumps and rubella vaccines are packaged with measles vaccine because they are indicated for the same age of children. Usually they are given about 1 year of age. So let me discuss those vaccines as well. This image shows neck swelling due to bilateral enlargement of the parotid salivary glands, which are in this area, the associated submandibular salivary glands, and lymph glands. It's due to mumps infection in a young child. Mumps can make you really miserable for a week. The swelling is very painful, as you can imagine, and it's accompanied by fever, tiredness, and headache. This is not an infectious disease that you or your loved ones want to risk getting. There's no specific treatment for it, and the complications can be very serious. Meningitis, which is inflammation of the lining of the around the brain, occurs in about 15% of mumps patients. This causes headache and stiff neck, and it can be fatal. Deafness can be caused by this also. Another feared complication is orchitis, or inflammation of the testicles. The men here can empathize with anyone who's gotten this very painful problem, the testicle swelling to approximately the size of a baseball. It occurs in up to 50% of the males. Now you can get really empathetic. 50% of the males who get mumps after the age of 12. It can result in infertility in males and in females because 5% of females over the age of 12 get ovarian inflammation, and there's a small incidence of pancreas inflammation. About 200,000 people annually were getting sickened with mumps prior to the vaccine, which was introduced around 1970. Cases of mumps plummeted within 90% in 10 years. That has saved us in the US from 800,000 or more cases of just mumps meningitis in the last 40 years. That's phenomenal. But most of us probably didn't even know that mumps causes meningitis. Why? Because the vaccine works so well. Rubella used to be called German measles. It is a relatively mild illness typically. In fact, 50% of kids who are infected with the virus don't get sick at all. For those who have symptoms, the illness starts with a low fever, tiredness, lymph gland swelling, and nasal congestion. Then a rash progresses over the body and fades away in about 3 days. Adults who are infected with rubella tend to become sicker than kids. Joint aching and swelling can last up to a month. Encephalitis or bleeding problems can happen. A few people died every year from rubella before the vaccine came out. However, the most feared complication of rubella, and the compelling reason to have every person vaccinated against this disease, is called congenital rubella syndrome. So this image depicts two twin girls who have been born to a mother who was infected with rubella while pregnant. The girl on the right was born normal, since the rubella virus did not infect her. However, the smaller sister on the left, it's a little bit hard to see in this view. The girl on the left's a little bit shorter. Was infected with the virus and sustained a number of congenital birth abnormalities, including retinopathy, type I damage, significant hearing loss, and accompanying heart defects. During the rubella epidemic of 1964 to 65, there were 20,000 cases of kids born in the US with congenital rubella syndrome. Additionally, 13,000 miscarriages and stillbirths from it occurred. And we do have one person here I know who suffered from congenital rubella syndrome, one of your professors here. And you may want to talk to her about her profound deafness that she copes with so very well after the talk today. Yet, now congenital rubella syndrome is very rare. Why? Thanks to the efficacy of the vaccine. With regard to measles vaccine, one persistent concern for some people is a question that was raised in a scientific paper published in 1998 in the well-known British medical journal called The Lancet. The lead author, Dr. A.J. Wakefield, alleged that the MMR vaccine may have been responsible for the cases of 12 children that developed autism. He claimed that the measles vaccine in particular caused brain damage. However, his research could not be reproduced by other researchers who severely criticized his methods. Furthermore, it was found that the author did not disclose that his research was being funded by lawyers seeking evidence to use against vaccine manufacturers. The author was disciplined, and the magazine retracted the article in 2010. More than 20 research projects published since 1998 have not shown any connection between MMR vaccine and the development of autism, or any other vaccine and the development of autism. However, many people are concerned about autism or other inaccurate information because they read it on social media. It's very important to go to the websites of organizations that give reliable, accurate information about vaccinations. These are two that I recommend the most. The websites of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Immunization Action Coalition. Most of the pictures I'm showing today come from these websites, along with those of the National Library of Medicine and the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. So moving up a generation, this is my paternal grandmother, Maude Gleason. She was a World War I Army nurse. A family story that shows her adventurous spirit concerns a biplane ride in Europe that she once took. How many of you know what a biplane is? Good. So you can imagine this. Shortly after World War I was over, my grandmother convinced an Army pilot to take her on a biplane ride over Paris, and they buzzed around the Eiffel Tower. The family story is that his superiors were not amused. After the war, Maude worked in the VA hospital in Silver City, New Mexico. When my dad was 2 years old and staying with a family friend while his mom worked as a nurse, my grandmother received a message saying, "Maude, come quick. Little Bobby has a fever and he's not moving well. We think he has polio." Now that was a message that would have struck terror in the heart of any mother at the time, for polio was called infantile paralysis. Up to 10% of kids with paralytic polio died right away from breathing muscle paralysis. Once the iron lung respirators became used in the 1940s and 50s, hospital wards became full of people needing ventilation for days, months, or years. Many of the others infected by polio had paraplegia from loss of function of both legs due to spinal cord damage, and many of those eventually died from complications of paralysis. Up to half of the people who had some early signs of paralysis recovered substantially, and my father was one of those lucky ones. This photo shows the only residual he had, which was a bit of facial weakness as a souvenir of his polio. You can see his left side of his face definitely drooping, the left lower eyelid drooping. He was in good company, as President Roosevelt, who guided the U.S. through World War II, was one of the most famous U.S. polio victims. He contracted the disease at the age of 39 and was weakened in both legs from the disease. This picture shows his wheelchair, which he rarely allowed to be photographed. In the 1950s and 60s, when the polio vaccines first became widely available in the U.S., my father made sure that his family went to stand in the long lines of people who waited at the public health clinics near our home to receive the new Salk and Sabin polio vaccines. Waiting in those long, long lines is one of my earliest memories. You see, polio continued to be common in the U.S. into the 1950s. In the year I was born, 1952, there were 23,000 Americans affected by polio. That would be equivalent to about 50,000 people now, since we have twice the population of 1952. The near elimination of polio in the US in the early 1960s prevented relief for worried parents and a victory for public health workers. Polio in the US became only a memory because vaccinations worked so well. John Nanny is a US member of the Rotary Service Group that promotes immunizations, and he does this from his wheelchair. The sign on the back of his wheelchair says, 65 years later, this is what polio looks like when a child is not vaccinated. Immunizations have been championed in developing countries of the world by such organizations as Rotary International, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Health Organization. This is a picture from the last 10 years that shows a group of polio victims. These Nigerian Muslim women are out in their hand-powered tricycle carts, moving up with their arms because their legs are paralyzed, with handmade signs on the back of each cart. They're going through this town telling the risk of not being vaccinated. Since polio virus only affects humans, like smallpox and measles, the natural polio virus can realistically be eliminated from the world, just like smallpox was. However, it's important to understand that the people in the US should stay immunized against polio until the polio virus is eliminated from the entire world. Why? Well, like measles, it is so contagious that it could easily be reintroduced into the US if a significant part of our population neglects to be vaccinated. This year, the natural polio virus has only caused a few infections worldwide in just 2 countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan. However, Americans are deeply involved in those countries. Polio is only a plane ride away from the US. Polio illustrates one of the key problems in assessing the effectiveness of preventative health care in America. That is, how does a family doctor prove to his patients that vaccines have helped their families to live better and live longer? No one wakes up with a message from the Almighty on their cell phone saying, it was a great decision on the part of your parents to give you polio vaccine. Otherwise, this is the day that you would have been paralyzed. Or this is the day that your spouse, your friend, your child would have been paralyzed. A conservative estimate is that without the polio vaccine, there would have been 500,000 cases of paralytic polio in the US from the mid-1960s until now. That would have been a staggering number of families affected. But to many people, statistics don't carry the emotional weight of someone's social media post that alleges that vaccines harm people. Those posts are often not based on fact and play up the fear of vaccines. I think it is a misguided fear, which should be directed to the illnesses these vaccines protect us against. Thus, vaccine hesitancy can grow despite the overwhelming evidence of the value of vaccines. My father had polio, and another of my parents suffered the consequences of vaccine-preventable diseases. My mother-in-law, Alice Adamson Huber, or Nana, as my daughters like to call her. I would like to dedicate my talk tonight to these 2 girls. Alice is a younger girl on the left of the picture. There are 2 reasons why you might consider I am dedicating my talk to my mother-in-law today. Either I liked her a lot, or I am in hot water with my wife, who is here, right in that row, and I need to score a lot of brownie points with her tonight. Well, it's the first. Alice was a very caring person who spent her life helping others. She was a registered nurse, and she served for many years as the head school nurse for the city of Downey in Southern California. As such, she was a strong advocate of immunizations. She represents for me the many millions of unsung people across the world who have prevented untold numbers of infectious diseases in the last 2 centuries through implementation of immunization programs. But there are 2 people in this photo. The other is Gertrude Adamson, Alice's older sister. She is on the right of the picture. Gertrude is the aunt that my wife never knew. You see, she came down with the infectious disease of diphtheria when she was 12 years old, shortly after this picture was taken, and died of the complication of heart failure at age 16. In 1921, when she was born, there were 206,000 cases of diphtheria in the US, with a staggering 15,500 deaths. The population then was 3 times less than now, so that's the equivalent of 600,000 cases of diphtheria and 46,000 deaths. Gertrude represents for me the many millions of people who have died of infectious diseases that are now preventable. Diphtheria commonly caused a terrible tonsillitis, like a strep throat on steroids. For those of you non-anatomic people here today, this is looking at the throat, and the white patches on each side of the throat are over the tonsils. The bacteria caused a toxin that it manufactured a toxin that kills the throat lining, causing a thick white membrane to form, which is the white line in the middle of the neck of this post-mortem specimen. So that white line should be clear so you can breathe through it. In modern times, a tracheostomy can be life-saving if the toxic membrane forms in the upper throat. However, the toxin can affect other organs also. My wife's aunt died of the heart damage from the toxin. When the diphtheria vaccine came into widespread use in the late 1940s, cases of diphtheria quickly plummeted, saving many people from Aunt Gertrude's fate. The Tdap vaccination, the diphtheria vaccine is included with the tetanus and pertussis vaccines in a combination called DTaP for kids and Tdap for adults. Why the combination? Well, I think we'd all agree we'd rather get 1 shot than 3. And many studies have shown that the body can process multiple vaccines given at once with effective antibody production for each vaccine given. So there's no reason to just give 1 vaccination at a time. That strategy may expose children to serious diseases if they're not fully immunized when they enter daycare or school. And given that a lot of kids go on daycare at 6 months of age, we really want to make sure those young kids get their vaccines early. So let me tell you about 2 diseases included in Tdap, the tetanus and pertussis, also called whooping cough. Tetanus is a severe, often fatal disease. Bacteria that cause tetanus are widely distributed throughout the world. These germs live in soil and street dust, and they're found in the waste of many animals. Tetanus bacteria are very resistant to heat and germ-killing cleansers. You can get the infection through small or large wounds, such as from a cut or nail puncture while working in the yard, or animal bites, or from accidents such as cutting yourself with a knife. The bacteria makes a toxin that causes spasm and weakness of the muscles in its victims. An especially tragic aspect of tetanus involves mothers and infants in the third world. Poor hygiene during childbirth can introduce the germ to mothers and their babies. Worldwide, tetanus in newborn infants continues to be a huge problem. In the year 2000, there were about 330,000 deaths worldwide, of which 50% were kids under 5 years old. Does tetanus vaccine work? Absolutely. In the US, deaths have gone down from 1,300 a year prior to the start of the vaccine use in the late 1940s, all the way down to about 200 cases of tetanus annually. So tetanus is infectious, but it's not contagious person to person. Unlike other vaccine-preventable diseases, immunization of other members of the community will not protect unimmunized people against this disease. It's widespread in the environment, so it can only be prevented by immunization. If vaccination against tetanus were stopped, persons of all ages in the US would be susceptible to this serious disease. So the 3 infectious diseases we are considering currently, pertussis, also called whooping cough, is the one besides measles you may have heard the most about in the last few years. It has recently been required for junior high school age kids to get a booster immunization for this disease. Also, there have been scattered reports of infants dying from pertussis, including a 4-week-old child who died in Modesto a few years ago. Whooping cough can be a very severe illness, resulting in prolonged coughing spells that can last for many weeks. In fact, the Japanese have called this a 100-day cough. Victims such as this young child can cough so hard that the coughing spells can make it difficult for a person to eat, drink, or breathe. Vomiting often occurs after a coughing spell. Persons may lose weight and become dehydrated. In infants, particularly very young babies, pertussis can cause pneumonia and lead to brain damage, seizures, mental retardation, and death. It's spread the same way that diphtheria, flu, cold, and other respiratory germs are spread. That is through sneezing, coughing, kissing, nasal secretions, and touching things that ill people have recently touched or coughed on. In the U.S., prior to the pertussis immunization, about 200,000 cases of pertussis were reported each year. There were up to 9,000 pertussis-related deaths each year. These numbers have gone way down since the widespread use of the vaccine. Pertussis cases occur throughout the world. If we stop pertussis immunizations in the U.S., we would experience a massive resurgence of pertussis whooping cough disease. A study in 1998 found that in 8 countries where immunization coverage was reduced, rates of pertussis surged up to 10 to 100 times in countries where the vaccines, compared to countries where the vaccines continued to be used. So unvaccinated children have a particular role in passing this disease. As an example, several years ago, I saw 2 elementary school age kids whose parents chose not to vaccinate their children at all. So when I saw them, they both had been coughing for a while, they had clear runny noses for a few days, but there was nothing noteworthy to suggest the illnesses were anything more than routine viral illnesses. However, the coughs intensified the next week. My partner saw them. He got positive nasal swabs for pertussis when he saw them. Appropriate antibiotics were given and the children recovered. From their parents' point of view, the decision to not immunize their kids was justified. The kids got sick, yes, but they were willing to use antibiotics and they recovered well. These parents are probably strongly against laws requiring pertussis and other vaccines for school entry. They may be homeschooling their kids at this point, since getting exemptions from laws is now much harder in California. So what are the problems with allowing freedom to choose immunizations? Many strong reasons for insisting on mandatory immunizations for school entry come immediately to my mind. The first one requires understanding that smallpox, polio, and measles are caused by viral germs. There is no treatment for those. They cannot be cured by antibiotics. Other infectious diseases caused by viruses that are on the recommended vaccine list for kids and adults are on this slide. Now, a few of these have antiviral medications, but typically those don't work very well. It's much better to not get the vaccines, or to not get the diseases and get the vaccines. For bacterial diseases like pertussis, diphtheria, tetanus, H. flu, and pneumococcus, there are antibiotics that sometimes cure people before they get really sick, or at least save the life of a very ill person. However, it's often too late to prevent serious harm or death from these illnesses. Pertussis is a great example because it's hard to diagnose in the initial stages. As I just discussed, it often starts off with symptoms identical to the usual viral cold and cough illnesses that kids get a couple times a year. If antibiotics are not administered within the first 2 weeks, there's no reduction in the length of the patient's cough, which can go on for many more weeks. Young infants with pertussis sadly pass away within a few days, even if they make it to the ICU. Also, the ill child is exposing people every day to that highly infectious germ, since they often are not very symptomatic in the first 1 to 2 weeks of illness. This is how people who are at a particularly high risk of severe illness and death can be infected. For instance, one of the kids that I saw could have transmitted pertussis to someone else at the school who was unimmunized, who then exposed someone at his home, such as his pregnant mother, if he had one, baby sister, 2-year-old brother, or his grandfather who has emphysema. Those types of people would have been at much higher risk of complications had they gotten the disease. So this discussion involves the age-old issue of individual liberty versus the protection of the surrounding community. For instance, when you drove to this talk tonight, did you feel free to run through all the red lights to make it here faster? I see some nodding, but I probably know, right? That could be very unsafe to you and others. We all know that. The community created laws against that. So to make informed decisions about immunizations, the community needs to know the risks of not vaccinating, which may not be obvious if the vaccines have been working very well. So it is important to understand the concept of what used to be called herd immunity. Now, who wants to be compared to a herd of cattle? It's a little bit unflattering, right? So now we call it community immunity. The principle is simply that as an increased percentage of the community is immunized against a given infection, at some point the circulation of that germ will be greatly reduced or eliminated. It turns out that that number is 95% for measles because it is so infectious. So we need 95% of the population to be immunized in order to protect those who are highly susceptible. So why might people be susceptible to measles and other infectious illnesses? I'll go into greater detail now, starting with examples from my own family. First, some people are more susceptible to diseases because of the meds they are on, the medications. My wife Katie is a good example of that, since she is on an immunosuppressive medication for rheumatoid arthritis. Over 20 years ago, she was afflicted with painful hand and foot swelling. Her fingers literally looked like hot dogs. Her immune system was attacking those joints. Methotrexate, a cancer medication, had just become the first widely used medication to suppress the immune system in diseases caused by immune system dysfunction, also called autoimmune diseases. That medicine has worked wonderfully for her. However, her immune system can't fight off infectious diseases as well now as before. As I previously mentioned, immunosuppressed people like her should not receive vaccines containing attenuated live viruses. Therefore, she is at greater risk of being afflicted by an infectious disease from an unvaccinated person. Now, she's old enough to have had measles herself. She doesn't have to worry about that. But what about kids? What about young adults who never had measles or maybe didn't have the vaccines? Now, there are a lot of diseases being treated with meds that suppress the immune system. Look at this list of diseases that can be treated with meds that suppress the immune system. And here's a partial list of the meds themselves. Most of you will recognize the heavily advertised medication called Humira. There's many other ones like Humira that are on this list. There are a lot of people with these diseases who are on the meds, like my wife in this community, and you would never know she had that disease or was on that med if you would look at her. This cute little guy is my grandson, Drew. He's a part of another large group that needs community immunity to protect them, babies. They may get some antibodies from their moms at birth against infectious diseases, but these antibodies only last for about 4 months. Their immune systems are still forming after birth. They are more vulnerable to these diseases until all of their personal vaccinations take effect. For measles, mumps, and rubella, that can take 16 months or more after birth to get all of their initial vaccinations. That's why it's important for others to get the vaccines, so that the babies are less likely to be exposed to these diseases. It's why parents, like my daughter, are vigilant in making sure that their babies are not in contact with unvaccinated children. She thinks that it's very important that our community agree on protecting its next generation through ensuring that we have adequate community immunity. Community immunity is also important in protecting folks over 50 years of age. Now, I realize that I'm taking my life in my hands by suggesting to baby boomers that they're getting old. We don't like to hear that. But good studies show that the immune system function goes down steadily from age 50 on. That's why the adult vaccination schedule calls for some vaccines to be given after 50 years of age. Those immunizations include ones for pneumococcus, influenza, and shingles. So moving on to another generation of my family, here's a recent picture of my daughter Lauren's family. I'd like to tell you something that happened in February of 2018 when we were visiting her in another city. Her daughter was only 2 years old then, and her son, whom they called the good old guy, wasn't born yet. Lauren looked over at me and said, "Dad, I just feel lousy. Would you take me to urgent care now?" This was an unusual request, so I said, "Well, what's happening?" She said, "I started feeling chilled last night with a headache and sore throat. Now I feel wiped out. I hurt all over. I started coughing and feel hot." So we went to urgent care where her throat swab for influenza was positive. We got her started on an anti-flu med immediately, and she felt better in 2 days, instead of the usual 5 or more days of illness. She told me that she had intended to get vaccinated, but just had let it slide in the whirlwind of working and having a kid. Fortunately, she had made sure that her daughter and husband had been immunized. My wife and I had been immunized as well, and sure enough, none of the rest of us became ill, despite being exposed to her. I think that the flu shot is the most misunderstood vaccine that we have available. So let me run through a few of these misunderstandings. The first is that the word flu means many different things. It's commonly used to refer to all sorts of viruses, such as the common cold or the stomach flu, which are both caused by totally different viruses than influenza. This lack of understanding of what doctors mean by flu causes a lot of confusion. Because of this confusion, a lot of people think that true flu, which doctors call influenza, is a trivial illness. They are badly mistaken. True flu causes high fever, sore throat, headaches, miserable muscle aches, and bad coughs. People with influenza generally are in bed feeling lousy for a week. Complications of influenza include viral and bacterial pneumonia, which sometimes cause death. Young kids, senior citizens, and immunocompromised people of all types are particularly vulnerable. It's also extremely contagious. So in the US, the CDC estimates that influenza has resulted in between 10 to 50 million illnesses annually in the US in the last decade. These illnesses have caused up to 1 million hospitalizations in a really bad year and up to 80,000 deaths annually. Some years feature particularly nasty strains of the flu virus. These are called pandemic years. The infamous 1918 influenza pandemic was unusually deadly and infected 500 million people around the world, which is about 1/4 of the world's population. 50 to 100 million people died. That made it one of the deadliest epidemics in human history. More recently, many of us remember the deadly H1N1 flu epidemic of 2009 and the large number of 20 to 30-year-old people who really got sick that year. A second misconception about flu is that the flu shot can give you the flu. That's totally false, as there are no live germs in that vaccine. However, the flu shot is given in the fall of the year, when the weather turns cold and there start to be a lot of other cough and cold viruses in circulation. So about 20% of people do get sick within 1 month of getting the flu shot, but it's almost always not infection with influenza. It's other germs. Thirdly, it's true that some people haven't had a bad attack of the flu for decades. But a recent study showed that up to half of people who get the flu virus only have mild symptoms that they don't identify as influenza. However, they can still spread the flu virus to other people who are much more susceptible, such as the people that I previously talked about. So fourth misconception is that some feel that certain groups shouldn't get the flu vaccine, such as infants and young children or pregnant women. Well, it turns out, as we just discussed, those are precisely some of the people who are most susceptible to getting severe flu illness and even death. A pregnant woman who gets flu is 4 times more likely to need hospitalization than a woman with flu who is not pregnant. Children under 5 also have much higher rates of flu-related hospitalization and death. A fifth misunderstanding about flu vaccine is that people may just plan to go to the doctor for medicine if they get sick. But antiviral meds really aren't very good for flu. My daughter had a really good result because she was on meds in less than a day after the first symptoms started. More commonly, meds just cut 1 day off the length of the illness if you start them within 2 days of the very first symptom onset. And they don't help much at all if you start after 48 hours. Plus, you are infectious to others for 24 hours before you start having symptoms, so you've exposed a lot of people before the meds help. A sixth misconception is that many people believe that the flu vaccine doesn't work at all or just works a little bit because of the 24/7 news cycle. A headline might say, this year's flu vaccine only prevented 20% of flu illnesses, or 40%, or 60%, and that headline plus 1 or 2 sound bites is all the information many people get about flu. So while it's true that the current flu vaccines are less than perfect, the story behind the story is that even for those who become ill from influenza, the flu vaccine often reduces the severity of the illness, as well as reducing complications such as pneumonia, hospitalization, and death. Now, you already met the good old guy. Drew is the newest generation in my family. He's fully immunized for his age of 7 months. This means he's gotten a series of 2 to 3 immunizations for each of these diseases: rotavirus, polio, hepatitis B, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, Hib, pneumococcus, and influenza. But he will wait to be 12 to 18 months old to get the MMR, chickenpox, and hepatitis A vaccines. So I want to mention the great value to Drew's generation of 2 relatively new vaccines, those for pneumococcus and Hib bacteria. So pneumococcus is a bacteria well adapted to invade the human body, and it can be resistant to many antibiotics. It can cause infections in different sites, such as ear, sinuses, and lungs. For instance, there's annually about 400,000 cases of pneumococcal pneumonia involving primarily either end of the age spectrum, either under 5 or over 65 years old, or immunocompromised individuals. From the initial site of the infection, this aggressive germ can become invasive. So invasive disease means that germs invade parts of the body that are normally free from germs. For example, pneumococcal bacterial can invade the bloodstream, causing bacteremia, and the tissues and fluids covering the brain and the spinal cord, causing meningitis. When this happens, illnesses are usually very severe, requiring treatment in a hospital and even causing death in some cases. Before the routine use of pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, about 17,000 cases of invasive disease occurred each year in children. 13,000 of those were the bacteremia type, and 700 were meningitis. 200 children died every year, and the others were disabled. All of them were hospitalized for a long time at huge costs. Although not considered invasive disease, an estimated 5 million cases of otitis media, ear infections, occurred each year among children younger than 5 years old. Since the routine use of the vaccine started in the early 2000s, invasive disease has gone down by 97%. And we saw this in my family practice. We heard about many more cases of invasive pneumococcal and H. flu infections before the year 2000 than after it. That's great news for my grandson and those of his generation. Hib is also a bacterial disease. The full name of the bacteria is Haemophilus influenza type B. That name is unfortunate since this germ has no relationship to the influenza virus. Invasive disease caused by Hib can affect many organ systems. The most common types of invasive disease are meningitis, epiglottitis, pneumonia, infectious arthritis, and cellulitis, meaning infection under the skin. So epiglottitis is an infection and swelling of the epiglottis, the tissue in the throat that covers and protects the voice box. Epiglottitis may cause life-threatening airway obstruction, something we tremendously feared as family doctors, seeing that case walk through our doors. So who this disease strikes is very age-dependent. In the pre-vaccine era, up to 60% of invasive disease occurred before age 12 months, precisely Drew's age. And before the introduction of effective vaccines, HIV was a leading cause of bacterial meningitis and other invasive bacterial diseases among children under 5 years of age. About 20,000 kids were infected with invasive HIV disease annually in the US. Remember, those kids were very sick and in the hospital. Some of them died, others had permanent disabilities. HIV vaccines came into widespread use in 1990. Invasive disease has declined by more than 99% compared with the pre-vaccine era. That's astounding. That's 20,000 young kids being saved every year from this life-threatening disease. Vaccine-hesitant people sometimes want to credit anything but vaccines for a modern relative freedom from vaccine-preventable infectious diseases that I've discussed tonight. The pneumococcal and HIV stories show that even within the recent past, that simply isn't true. So what will the future hold for Drew, his sister, and those of their generation regarding infectious diseases? I see many of you are young enough, you probably haven't started families yet or have young kids. What about for your kids and future generations? Well, I think more and better vaccinations would help. For instance, Drew was just in the hospital last month with a disease called RSV bronchiolitis. The poor guy was breathing up to 90 breaths a minute and needed oxygen for 4 days. This is a very common virus that can be especially deadly in premature and young babies. It can also make you or I cough for a very long time or get pneumonia. RSV vaccines are in development, but they're not yet generally available. Lauren tells me that after spending 4 very scary days at home watching Drew breathe really, really fast, 4 days in the hospital while caring for Drew, she would be absolutely thrilled to know that future generation, perhaps her grandchildren, would be protected from RSV. Another vaccine that I really wish would be available to protect Drew and everybody else is against a disease carried by this little pest, the Culex mosquito. Does anybody recognize this? Well, it's in Modesto. It is a West Nile virus carrier, which is very dangerous to people over 50 years old, like many of us in the room. One year, we identified 7 patients at Cornerstone Family Medical Group with West Nile fever, and several of them got the neurological illness associated with West Nile, which is encephalitis and meningitis. 2 of them were severely affected with meningitis. They survived, but the resulting problems were permanent. There are 4 licensed vaccines for horses against West Nile virus. 4. How many are available for humans? 0. That's right. Despite the fact that a very promising candidate vaccine was developed, the necessary human trials were not done. They were going to be too expensive for the projected profit available. So much better to be a horse than a human when it comes to West Nile. So, regarding vaccine development, a common misconception is that a vaccine administration is a big moneymaker for doctors, healthcare organizations, and vaccine manufacturers. Therefore, they push it to everyone else's detriment. That's simply not true. Vaccines are not a high-profit item. From my clinic, we felt at best we just broke even financially doing immunizations. But we regarded it as in our patients' best interest to do them. In terms of manufacturers, standards for vaccine development in humans, more so than horses, are very high and they cost a lot to meet. So there's no guarantee that a vaccine will be profitable unless you make it for a horse. This illustrates a key point for the future of vaccines, our responsibility to encourage lawmakers and medical companies to fund more vaccine development. Since it is so costly to create human vaccines, we need to encourage progress in helping other infectious diseases that we face to become vaccine-preventable diseases. Tonight, I've described the illnesses and devastation caused by infectious diseases in the eras before immunizations came into common use. You've heard about the incredible results from vaccines, such as those for smallpox, polio, diphtheria, tetanus, measles, mumps, and rubella. And I pointed out that even in our modern era, Continued vaccine development has benefited us, such as those for influenza, pneumococcus, and Hib. I've had the opportunity to address a number of misconceptions contributing to vaccine hesitancy. My goal for this talk was to make the case for vaccinations as one of the most important health advances in human history. I've said that vaccinations will continue in the future to have an importance for our worldwide public health, similar to clean water, nutritious food, sanitary waste disposal, and healthy housing accommodations. I also said that we have to remember the lessons from the past in order to make informed decisions about the present and the future. I hope that telling you a little bit about the 7 generations in my family has helped you to see the tremendous value of immunizations for both America and the whole world. Therefore, I'd like to conclude my talk with a rereading from a physician named E.J. Gangarosa, who specialized in infectious diseases and became a crusader for saving lives through making clean water available throughout the world. Before he was born, his family immigrated to the U.S. from Sicily. He wrote this 19 years ago. He said, "I am one of the increasingly rare old-timers who lived during the pre-vaccination era. I am the second to the last of 13 siblings, 5 of whom died of vaccine-preventable illnesses in infancy. Born to poor immigrant parents, I remember well my mother's account of the causes of their deaths, 3 from la tosse forte, meaning strong cough and referring to whooping cough, and 2 siblings from roseolia, the word for measles. Even after many years had passed, she spoke of these morte de angeli, death of her angels, with a great deal of emotion. Imagine losing not 1, 2, 3, or 4 kids, but rather 5 babies. It was common in the pre-vaccine era. Like our family, many families lost several children to these diseases. We forget. Time blurs our memories of these common tragedies of yesteryear. I remember well," he goes on to write, "during the winter and spring of each year, hearing the whoop of pertussis whooping cough in movie theaters and school assemblies, in assorted gatherings. Today, few have ever heard this, and those who have forget. I remember the summer outbreaks of polio, the crippled children who could no longer walk or walked with limb-distorted limps. As a 3rd and 4th year medical student, I remember answering the appeals of hospital administrators who could not find the nursing staff for special duty tending to the needs of polio patients in iron lungs. We forget. I remember the awful cases of measles my own children experienced. I remember the children with smallpox during the years my family lived in Pakistan. I remember those who lost their sight from smallpox lesions in their eyes. I remember those who died. We forget." Well, I hope tonight will encourage you to continue doing your own research about vaccine-preventable infectious diseases, perhaps even finding out the ways immunizations have helped your families, and that you will join my mother-in-law Alice, myself, and my daughter Lauren in being advocates for immunizations. Thank you.